The Massive Challenge of Hydrogen. Interview with Florian Kern, episode 63. Welcome to the My Energy 2050 podcast, where we speak to the people building a clean energy system by 2050. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. This week, we speak with Florian Kern. He is the head of the research field of ecological economics and environmental policy at the Institute for Ecological Economy Research in Berlin. He holds a PhD in science and technology policy from the University of Sussex. Florian and I discuss the challenge of hydrogen and what needs to be done before large-scale deployment occurs. We talk about hydrogen-ready infrastructure and whether this is just a PR exercise on the part of the gas sector, or is there really a future of hydrogen being transported like gas is today? I would say our conversation is pretty raw in this sense. This conversation with Florian delivers a fairly objective and lively discussion on the requirements of what is needed to make the hydrogen economy part of the industrial base. As you'll hear, the electrification of the energy sector is essential to make hydrogen a reality for industry. I came away from this conversation with a deeper understanding of the massive energy requirements for industry. That's why I'm using massive in the title. Replacing coal or gas, fossil fuels, for industry is a huge challenge that requires giving up fossil fuels in other areas of life in order to enable either the remaining fossil fuels to be used in industry or to enable large-scale renewable energy infrastructure to produce green hydrogen. So, if that's too complex, listen to this episode and you'll understand how the challenges that we faced of producing hydrogen are quite large and how industry can use it in a cost-effective manner. But yeah, there's still a lot of ifs out there, and particularly when we start talking about the timeline. By the end of this episode, you should understand that to build the renewable energy infrastructure to produce green hydrogen, then electrification of transport and residential heating needs to occur first. Once sufficient renewables are built to meet everyday uses, then hydrogen can be produced from renewables. Okay, I'm simplifying our discussion, but hopefully that makes sense. So for me, this episode delivers a new appreciation of the scales of renewables that need to be deployed to produce hydrogen. The promises that the new gas infrastructure being built for hydrogen appears far off because of the massive amounts needed for industry. In short, the energy transition includes hydrogen, but we need to rationally assess the demand for hydrogen in the short term, basically. The cost, this includes the cost and how it can be produced to meet the requirements for industrial processes. A final note, the interview was done for my current role as an Open Society University Network Senior Fellow at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The funding was generously provided to produce the podcast until the end of 2022. So we have some amazing interviews coming up. The intent of the My Energy 2050 podcast is to spread the knowledge about how the energy system can assist our transition towards a greener future. And just a note that acknowledges my absence for the past few months. I'm back and committed. I had too many commitments these past few months, so I had to cut back a bit. But I am excited to be back and producing more episodes for the next year. This actually is great because I'm on sabbatical from my day job, which means more time for podcasting. So stay tuned for more great episodes. And now for this week's episode. I'm here today with Florian Kern to discuss hydrogen. Florian, I just want to first start off and thank you for joining the My Energy 2050 podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
And we should mention where we are because we have this unique sound environment. We're in a nice garden. Would you call this like a coffee garden, tea garden?
Yeah, I think it's a nice coffee place inside a park.
Okay, perfect. So we have some outdoor noises, I think, coming through. Florian, my first question to you is about your background. You do a range of research in the energy sector with different policies, different technologies involved, but we're going to specifically talk about hydrogen today. And how did you become interested in this topic, but also kind of what's your career path that brings you to the head of your institute?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I've a degree in political science originally, and then I was very interested in environmental issues, especially climate change, and obviously very much so energy policy, since it's so closely related. I did an environmental policy and planning degree in Denmark. Obviously, in terms of addressing climate change, clean technologies are really part of the answer, not the only answer, and we can come back to that. So I really became interested in this idea of low carbon transitions and how can we support them? What can policymakers do to direct and accelerate the transitions towards low carbon energy systems? That led me to do a PhD at the University of Sussex at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit, where you could do a degree in science and technology policy. So, and I was there as part of the Sussex Energy Group, one of the largest independent energy policy research groups that are researching these issues. And I've been studying a range of technologies, and the latest hype is hydrogen. And here we are talking about hydrogen.
Yes, but let me go first. The next question will be about hydrogen, I promise. But the degree in science and technology, because this is kind of unique, because I would say it's interdisciplinary degree that you got. And so you had to look at technology and science, like, of course, from a different type of angle, rather than I'm a geographer, so I had kind of this geographic lens, or we have sociology that could also look at social trends and energy. But how does a degree in science and technology influence how you approach technologies in the energy sector?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's science and technology policy. So actually the focus is on policy. The question is really, how can policy support science and technology development? And you're right, this is an interdisciplinary research area. This is something where SPRU, where I did my PhD, is one of the world's largest and first centers to study the development of science and technology in an interdisciplinary way. So it draws partly on economics, evolutionary economics especially, but also other things like institutional theories, political science. And one of the things that was always very close to the heart at SPRU is that people need to understand a little bit about the technologies as well that they're studying. So we have quite a few people who had an engineering background who understood a bit of the technical issues as well as the social science issues. And it's really that unique combination of bringing together these different knowledges to study these issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So then let's move on to the hydrogen, because how does that inform your approach to hydrogen, if we can do that? Because we definitely have there's technology out there for hydrogen, and then there's the policy environment. So far, there's some missing links to make full-scale deployment of hydrogen a possibility. My question to you then is, why is it so hard for new technologies to be introduced into the energy system?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great starting point. I think what we've seen over the last 20 years or so, where people have studied these historical transitions, and of course energy systems have historically changed hugely over time, but there are a number of characteristics of energy systems that make that a really slow and often painful process. One of them, of course, is that we're very much locked into current ways of doing things. That's partly because energy is very much a sector where you have long-term investments, where you have huge infrastructures, where getting rid of infrastructures entails huge sunk investments. Of course, also the oil and gas sector are very powerful actors politically, and so therefore to do things that are potentially not in their interest is very difficult to do. So when we think about transitions, we really see those as socio-technical configurations that need to change. So it is partly about the technologies, it's partly, on the production side, it's partly about the infrastructures needed, whether those are wires or pipelines or what have you. And of course, there's a need for technical change in terms of, for example, generation technologies, so on and so on. As I said, it's about much more than that. It's also about cultural issues. For example, if you think about oil and you think about car dependency and cultural issues attached with that. So there's a range of social issues that come into that. There's, of course, a huge role for regulation, for policy in terms of, energy is obviously a very regulated sector. And I think the bigger picture is that you have so many different elements that make up a socio-technical system that are very closely aligned and are actually working pretty well. We have a relatively good transport system. We have electricity that when you flick on the light comes on, and all the rest of. So actually, these systems have been developed over decades. There's a lot of investment in them. And therefore, there's strong interest in keeping things as they are. And if you want to start changing things, you have to literally change all of the individual bits, from the technology to the infrastructure to maybe some behavioral issues to market arrangement policies. So that makes it very difficult and very slow to change things.
And then is this one of the areas where hydrogen is attractive? Because you mentioned the oil and gas sector, for example. Hydrogen, I would say, is being promoted as an alternative or just a step away from gas. In one sense, is the appeal for hydrogen is because it's not a radical change, even though, I mean, we can get into how radical a change it is, because in one sense it is. Why is hydrogen, maybe I just frame it in a bigger sense, why is hydrogen a technology that's appealing to many gas companies?
Yeah, no, that's a very good reason. I mean, I think different actors promote hydrogen for different reasons, but I think for the gas companies, it's kind of a way to keep their existing business model alive and maybe even reuse some of the existing infrastructures you have in terms of pipelines, for example. There need to be sort of small technical changes made to the pipeline system because hydrogen is very small, so you got to make sure that you're not losing too much on the way, but in principle you can use that. But also, I mean, we're looking at this from a policy point of view, obviously. And I mean, for policymakers, one of the main motivations for thinking about hydrogen, obviously more recently, there's been a lot of concern about energy security and the supply of gas. So that now plays an important role. But when many countries started the hydrogen programs over the last 5 years or so, one of the key motivations, of course, climate change and how to decarbonize the whole energy sector, as well as the entire economy around it. And I think that's the major difference for why there's so much interest in hydrogen now compared to 10, 15 years ago. Because back then, the main story was how to decarbonize electricity. And that's fine, and that gets you so far, and you can reduce emissions. And quite a few countries in Europe have made a lot of progress in that regard. But now it's, if we're serious about being carbon neutral by 2050, or in the German case, even by 2045, that means decarbonizing the whole economy. And and over the last 5 years or so, the policy goals have changed dramatically. To basically that means in every sector of the economy reduced to zero. And we have not even begun to understand what that entails, how difficult that is. And therefore, there is this appeal to hydrogen that, oh, great, we can use hydrogen. We're the hydrogen economy, and hydrogen can decarbonize everything. It's not just about electricity or gas, it's about the whole economy.
And is it true? Can hydrogen solve all our problems, or 80% of our problems? From a policy perspective?
No.
Okay.
I think this is actually one of the big dangers. I'm not against hydrogen at all. I think hydrogen is an important part of the transition towards a low-carbon economy. But hydrogen has a range of disadvantages. Hydrogen is very energy-intensive to produce. I mean, one thing that people need to understand is that it's not an energy source. It's not like oil or gas. It's an energy vector. It's a carrier. So you've got to spend energy on producing that hydrogen in the first place, and then you can use that for all sorts of things. I mean, from our research, what we would say is that there are a range of applications where we have very few or no technical alternative for decarbonization. So if you think about the steel sector, how is the steel sector going to be carbon neutral by 2045? There, hydrogen really does make sense as the main technological option to pursue, and we need to see huge investments in that sector over the next decade or so that that can be worked out. So there, it totally makes sense. In other applications, how do we heat our homes? Now people go around, now with the energy security concerns is a whole new ball game. But even before that, people were going around basically telling people, you don't need to change anything. You have your boilers. The natural gas companies, for example, the pipeline operators were telling people, no, it's fine. No need to invest in heat pumps. Don't do that because, it'll be all hydrogen. It'll be all fine. And I think that is a major danger in terms of continuing carbon lock-in and also locking out better alternatives.
Yes.
And the last point is maybe about vehicles.
Yes.
So, people have been talking about hydrogen-fueled vehicles. A third of people in service in Germany believe that in 10 years' time they will drive a hydrogen-powered vehicle, not appreciating that most likely that will be an electric vehicle, and the hydrogen is just instead of the battery. It's not a combustion engine. But that for these types of applications where we do have a direct battery electric solution, it absolutely makes no sense to use hydrogen, because hydrogen has 4, 5 times, 6 times the energy need compared to just using the electricity for an electric vehicle. So, but we do see companies push that, of course, nevertheless.
Because you can more easily engineer an internal combustion engine to use hydrogen rather than going electric car. Is that?
No. It's on the. It's in terms of how much energy do you use to drive X amount of kilometers.
Okay.
And
the
point is that you can use that electricity directly in the car to drive those 100 kilometers, or you can first produce electricity.
Yes.
Then use that electricity to produce hydrogen.
Okay. Yes.
Then you produce hydrogen, and you need to get it to the vehicle,
basically,
and then convert it back into electricity. So all the losses that you have along that long chain make it so that it's not a very efficient way to power a vehicle.
Right.
I mean, large vehicle. I mean, there is an open question there about very heavy equipment, machinery, and stuff like that. But even there, China has been making a lot of progress with different types of batteries, and so I think there it remains a bit of an open question. But from our point of view, sort of cars that we drive around in definitely not a good option.
Okay,
so it's not a silver bullet, and the concern is that the hype basically stops also other low carbon trajectories. I mentioned heat pumps as an example. So there's a real concern here that if we're telling people, no, it's fine, just keep your gas boilers. It'll be expensive now, but later we'll have hydrogen, and then nothing changes in terms of the business models, in terms of the equipment. Then it's
like
really
pumping hydrogen into people's homes. That's not logical in the future.
No.
Yeah. And then I want to go back to, because you mentioned it and you also addressed it in the car example, but as a vector, hydrogen as a vector, could you explain that a bit more and just how the process actually works? Is this conversion technology, for example, in front of you, this green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, maybe talk about what is the difference between these types of colored hydrogens?
Yes.
And how does that make hydrogen a vector? A vector change, or however you. I haven't heard that word before.
Okay.
So
So the point is really that oil and gas were things we tapped into, and that energy was there. It had been converted from biomass a long time ago, but we didn't have to do anything to do that. And then we just took it out of the ground and we burned it, and that released the energy. So also there's a question, of course, how much energy you need to invest to get that energy out. So this was the energy return on investment kind of equation that people have been talking about. But hydrogen needs to be produced somewhere. It's not to be found. It's not like we're tapping into a hydrogen reservoir. The molecule needs to be produced somehow, and we can do that in different ways. Of course, from a climate change perspective, the main way in which people imagine that this would be helpful to decarbonizing the global economy would be to use electricity produced via renewables to then produce hydrogen, to then use that in different application areas. So that's the so-called green hydrogen. So that means you're using renewable green electricity to produce the hydrogen and then use it for whatever application you want, and that's zero or relatively low carbon. Of course,
is that the best kind of hydrogen?
Green
hydrogen.
From a climate point of view, that is kind of the cleanest hydrogen.
Cleanest.
In that sense, against the climate change targets, that's the best. There is very little of that in Germany, for example, at the moment. So there are some industrial applications today where hydrogen is used and has been used, for example, in refineries, and that hydrogen is produced from natural gas.
Okay.
So that's steam reformation or gasification from natural gas, and that's the so-called grey hydrogen. So that's being used in industry in relatively small quantities, and that's obviously not renewable. So in terms of the carbon footprint of that activity, that isn't great.
Okay, right.
That's the green and the grey. Then there's the blue hydrogen, which is produced exactly the same way as the grey hydrogen, but you capture the emissions. So this is grey hydrogen plus carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, and then you have your blue hydrogen. I mean, the molecules are always the same. The hydrogen is always the same. The question is about how do you produce it? And what's the carbon footprint of that activity?
So the idea then, so let me clarify then. So grey hydrogen, there's also pink, but it's not on
Yeah,
your
you can come
chart.
to that.
Yeah, okay. So gray hydrogen is when you're converting gas to hydrogen, but you're not capturing the CO2 emissions from that.
That's right.
But blue hydrogen is when you're producing hydrogen from gas and you're capturing the CO2 emissions.
That's correct.
Okay. And then what's pink? I love pink hydrogen. What's pink hydrogen?
Pink is basically like green. So you use the same technology, electrolysis, but this is not powered by renewables, but by nuclear.
Yes.
So that's also a low carbon option that obviously has a different risk-reward profile compared to some renewables, but that is pink hydrogen.
Yes.
And then we also have turquoise, which is basically like gray. It's made from gas, but it's using a different technology. So that's done using pyrolysis. And then you separate the carbon out, but it's solid.
Okay.
I'm not an engineer, so don't ask any detailed question about how that works, but this is kind of the color coding of hydrogen.
Exactly. It's one of those things you bring up, and then let's move on quickly because we don't want to go into too much that. Okay. So these are all the types of hydrogen, and of course, maybe if there's pink hydrogen in Germany, it's made in France and exported to Germany rather than made in Germany. So that's my joke, but. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, at the moment it's the other way around, isn't it? At the moment, Germany needs to produce a lot of extra electricity, partly burning gas to deliver it to France because there's a lack of. I mean, but joking aside, this is actually the important point here. Yeah. I was talking about the efficiency earlier, for example, using it in vehicles, and if you need 5 or 6 times that electricity to power a vehicle the same distance, it's not a good idea because I mean, in all of this is kind of the bottleneck. You were asking, is hydrogen the solution for everything? And I do think there are a range of sectors where it's really needed as a solution because we don't have any other possibilities. But the big bottleneck at the moment is deployment of renewables. Do we have enough electricity first to fully decarbonize the electricity sector? Which, in Germany we're about 50% there. So, that's better than most countries, but not good enough. We still have a lot of, coal on our electricity system. So, yes, I mean, have an accelerated rollout of renewables is really the basis then for producing that green hydrogen. And that will be the bottleneck. We will have to accelerate renewables deployment in Germany, but also all forecasts, all studies that you look at say that, we'll probably import 70% of that hydrogen from abroad, which is not surprising. Germany is not a resource-endowed country, and it's basically the same situation we're in now. We're also importing most of our energy needs. The difference, of course, is that green electricity can be produced in any country, whereas fossil fuels were obviously concentrated in certain areas.
And so where would those imports come from?
That's an interesting question. There are kind of negotiations going on between the German government. They have set up a range of hydrogen partnerships with partner countries. So they're talking about Australia, they're talking to Canada, but also a range of African countries in the MENA region, where the idea is that people would invest in large-scale renewable production capacity, that it would be converted, or the hydrogen would be produced over there, and then we would import it in big tankers like we would now import LNG, liquefied natural gas.
It's because, there's different ways, but it's so much more efficient to produce from renewable energy in, say, more southern sunny countries or more windy countries, or
yes, it's partly that, and also of course also partly population density and how much space do you have? I mean, the German government now has this target of 2% of the country's surface needs to be reserved for wind rollout, but that's just to green the electricity sector. That doesn't have then the numbers are huge. I mean, that's one of the things when we were talking about what are the application areas, and our research, we did sort of a meta study together with colleagues from the Border Step Institute, and they reviewed the existing evidence, and of course this is all difficult to assess, but they were trying to figure out sort of how fast could the production capacity and import capacity increase over time for hydrogen compared to if all these industrial sectors where people now say this is a great opportunity, we need to decarbonize, if calculate what's their need, how much hydrogen do they actually need, and these are completely out of sync.
Okay, because it's so big.
Yes, I mean, just the chemical industry or just the steel industry. I mean, they are huge energy users. I mean, Germany, of course, is a pretty industrial economy still compared to other countries. We do have a service sector, but manufacturing is big in Germany, so there's also big energy needs of these sectors.
Yes. So, and actually, maybe we underappreciate how energy intensive industry is. I mean, unless you go and visit one of these facilities, I think like a steel mill or a chemical industry, right? How much gas they use and how much gas they require. If you think of what Nord Stream, whichever pipeline you want to take, but it's this huge capacity for moving away from coal, which provided this power, this energy, and the ingredients for the steel mills, for example, like the hard coal. But then if you think about the imports that were necessary to maintain German industry in a competitive manner, like a price competitive manner, the answer was Russian gas to be more green. And if you think about then if hydrogen is going to replace that, it's a huge amount of I've never thought about that. So it's a huge amount of hydrogen actually that's required to displace gas and, let's say, fossil fuels from the energy mix for industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge challenge.
Okay, that was my.
And that's why we've written a policy briefing about this recently, and that was one of the conclusions, to say to policymakers, this idea that hydrogen can sort it all out is really unhelpful.
Okay,
because from our perspective, and I was talking about comparing the numbers of what are the maybe production capacities in the future, and there's obviously huge uncertainty bars on these estimates, but just comparing sort of the estimates for what can be produced and what can be imported to what will be needed is so huge that even that just means we probably need to prioritize and say, okay, here we don't have a decent technological alternative for decarbonization, therefore this is a priority sector. Steel has to get the hydrogen, whereas something else where we have a direct electric alternative, that's technically in terms of the efficiency the better way to go, but it's also in terms of the numbers. If this is a scarce commodity in the future, for the foreseeable future, then we need to invest it where we get the biggest carbon reduction from it.
Which would be industry. I mean, from looking at it now is from industry then. My next question is, what are the key technological developments that need to be solved? Because in one sense, we've talked about the policy, and actually, I mean, it's a huge challenge, much more than I've ever even thought about. And I know you're coming from a policy perspective, but even looking at that, what are some of the technological challenges that the research is showing now to deploy hydrogen at a larger scale than what it is now?
I mean, I think there are a range of technical issues that have to do with scaling up. So we've just talked about the vast scale that industry would have to be, and I think history of technological developments shows that scaling up is a good thing in terms of economies of scale. It also leads to some teething problems, often technically, that it's not that straightforward to do the same thing at a 1 megawatt scale and then to do it at a gigawatt scale, which you would need to do. That this is not so straightforward. So there may also be a range of teething issues, because I think in terms of the core technology, at least in terms of electrolysis, which is kind of the main pathway right now that is being pursued, I think that will be the major issue. It's not so much, we need R&D and we need all sorts of new technologies. Although, I mean, I was at a stakeholder event here in Berlin yesterday where there was a range of industry people, and they were basically saying, well, why is there this monopoly on this one technological solution? Surely there are a range of ways in which we can produce hydrogen, and can we not, should the government not be spending more money on this? And I'm not against that, and obviously it's good to have alternative pathways, and R&D is also, from a policy perspective, is relatively cheap to support some R&D, and it's a good idea. If we are to become a hydrogen economy, then surely it's worth spending some money on exploring alternative technologies. But I think what's at stake now is really the rollout, the scaling up. And there, I think it's actually not so much there are the teething issues that I mentioned, but it's mainly about upscaling, cost reduction, economies of scale, and rollout. I think that's the main challenge.
It's a rollout. And you mentioned you were at a stakeholder event. Maybe, yeah, I don't know what phase of the research that was, but could you maybe give some feedback or discuss what was discussed? What was some of the industry feedback about hydrogen? Or in general, what are you hearing?
There was huge interest, and there was companies from all across the chain, if you want, from people who produce technologies to produce hydrogen, to industries that are interested in maybe buying it, using it in their production facilities. So there is a lot of interest in hydrogen. There were quite a few also gas companies interested in that, and we talked a little bit about that. And I think what they're mainly asking for is Germany has a hydrogen, or has had a national hydrogen strategy since 2 years ago, and they've developed a range of policies to support hydrogen, and they wanted to provide some clarity to the industry that yes, we are planning with hydrogen and that this is an area worth investing in. So I think they got industry on board. I think there's a lot of interest in that.
Yes.
But they were also pointing, of course, to a lot of open questions. There were two panels with policymakers, some from the respective German ministries, so the Ministry for Research and Education, as well as the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Change. And of course, they have to do their homework. They have to have good subsidy available for these things. But people were also pointing to the European level, where we discussed about green hydrogen. In principle, this definition of what is green hydrogen is fairly straightforward.
Yes.
But in practice, it's not that much, or at least not in the first formulation, because that definition is being worked on at the European level.
Okay.
And that was one of the things that the stakeholders pointed to yesterday, to say, because in one sense what policymakers are trying to do is to make sure that this is additional green electricity that's being used to produce the hydrogen, and it's not taking off the grid to produce hydrogen, and then we use coal to pulse our electricity, to supply electricity. So the question is, how do you do that? Is that a second by second thing that you have to balance? Yes. And you have to make sure that the grid is 100% renewable, and then only then it's green hydrogen?
Yes.
Or is it, I think...
you just taking from the grid, but it's also maybe 10-15% coal in there.
Well, that's a different matter. I mean, I think that can be solved via a certificate solution.
Okay.
So, overall your consumption is this, and you have to, make sure that all of this, what you bought, is green electricity. So it's not so much a question of what's in the grid. It's more a question of, is this additional electricity that is being used, or are you taking it from the electricity system, and that means other electricity users use coal, or there's more coal on the system. So I think there's a compromise being worked on, but so that's kind of one of the things that stakeholders were pointing to. So we need to have that definition, we need to have it soon, otherwise we can't make any investment decisions.
But then this is really, let me break that apart a bit, because this is really difficult then, because are they saying, or anyone saying, that you need dedicated infrastructure, green energy, like solar, wind, producing just green hydrogen, like it's set aside, this infrastructure that's dedicated for producing hydrogen?
I think the point is you need additional capacity to generate that green electricity. And that's really the core. Otherwise, this is not part of a decarbonization strategy.
Yes.
And whether that is, so that's dedicated investments. Whether that is then linked up to the grid, I think that's a technical question. But yes, there will be huge needs for green electricity, and that's the point. And
yes. And so, this. Then maybe we'll go to the EU level or goals overall, and this is not so much about hydrogen, but more about electricity and kind of the, I would say, Fit for 55 or Repower EU plans, that it makes these targets that they have, and I won't say what the targets are, but makes these targets, like the decarbonization of the energy sector, even more important, especially in the everyday use of electricity. Let's say that electrification of transportation and electrification of heat, and it makes those targets even more important, because then some of the other infrastructure to produce hydrogen, or that can feed into industry, is really important then to make this transition. Not to have like existing carbon producing fossil fuels in the energy system, while some of it, there's insufficient capacity for industry.
Yeah, that is what I was talking. That is the main challenge. That we need huge amounts of green electricity. Basically, is the point. We need huge infrastructure for that. We need huge amount of investment for that.
Yeah.
And first and foremost, of course, we need to sort out the electricity sector. That needs to be 100% low carbon, and then we will have a whole range of additional needs on electricity for decarbonization, transport, heat, but also that hydrogen that needs to be produced.
Yes.
And therefore this plea that you only use hydrogen where there's no other option, where we can directly use electricity, let's do that. That's much more efficient.
Yes.
Because otherwise the quantities quadruple another time to do that. So it's really a numbers game, and it's really important. And I mean, I think that's also one of the roles of at the European level to help fund that infrastructure rollout and connect things up. I mean, people are talking about hydrogen pipelines, hydrogen infrastructure, a backbone. So that's another role for policy as well. It's not just to provide certainty about the investment and the definitions of what is green hydrogen and so on and so forth, but also in terms of this infrastructure. And there are funding programs underway where there are the Commission is funding a range of these projects that are supposed to be linked up and provide sort of a backbone of a hydrogen infrastructure in Europe. Yeah,
exactly. So let me follow. I have two more questions, and we can end this. One is building the gas infrastructure now, and then saying it's like dual use, or I think there's a specific term for this, right? And how much is
they're talking about hydrogen ready.
Hydrogen ready, yeah, that's exactly right. Dual use technology is something else, right? But hydrogen ready, and how much is it about making the gas infrastructure hydrogen ready, but then how much does that perpetuate the use of gas? Like I was just at a conference here, and there's going to be like 4 or 5 new LNG terminals in Germany. Like this is what's being planned.
Yes.
Hydrogen ready probably, right?
That's the plan. That's in the contract.
Yeah, it's in the contract. But then how much does that lock the system into gas then?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult topic, because obviously there is an energy shortage crisis right now in Germany, and obviously we need to import gas in the short run to power the economy, to heat people's homes. That's not something that we can change overnight. I mean, one can decry that, of course, the last 10-15 years policymakers should have done much more to get away from fossil fuels, and we wouldn't be in that situation. But I mean, that's a moot point. We are in this situation, and therefore these LNG import terminals are being built and will help us to get over this winter and next year's winter. But it's a really important point about this. Isn't this continuing carbon lock-in? And that's one of our concerns. We were talking about this earlier in terms of the heating. And I think it is a major risk now to tell people, no, just keep your boilers, it's fine. We'll sort you out with LNG this year and next year. And then at some point we'll have a hydrogen. Because as I said, it's a real numbers game. And if we don't manage to produce or import the kind of, huge scale we need to, what's going to happen? They're just going to run on natural gas.
Yes.
For a long time. Yeah. And we cannot afford this to happen. And this is also where I get worried. Coming back to that stakeholder conference yesterday, there was then a discussion about, why is it that we're only talking about green hydrogen? Isn't it the case that if we want this quick scale up, this quick rollout that the government is talking about, don't we then need to also do grey hydrogen and all the other ones in between? And there was a real discussion going on there, and many people in industry saw that as a way, well, this is an enabler of green hydrogen in the long run, or this is a bridge to green hydrogen, but for now we need to do everything. To be honest, I'm not convinced by these arguments at all. I think these are interest-driven arguments, and the German Advisory Council on Environmental Policy has published on this a great report, and there was someone presenting the findings yesterday, and they were saying, well, we don't really buy that argument, because if we want to be climate neutral by 2045, that use of grey hydrogen probably would have to stop a few years earlier. Let's say 2040. These people who are at the conference presenting that they can do grey hydrogen, they were saying, we can do this now. Obviously, it's very small. If we need to scale that up, we need to develop that a little bit. So we couldn't do it right now, but maybe by 2030 we'd be up and running. And then I'm thinking, okay, 2030 till 2040, a huge infrastructure, very capital intensive for 10 years. How is that going to be a bridge? It's going to be a very expensive and very short bridge.
Yes. It can't
and
last.
In terms of climate impact, obviously, I mean, what we're interested in at the end of the day is not to reach some kind of arbitrary mark in 2045. It's the cumulative emissions over time. I don't see how hydrogen that is produced from natural gas is a helpful bridge in that sense at all.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And my last question, and maybe that shouldn't be the last question, so maybe I throw in a soft question after this one. And you mentioned it, the high energy price. How much is the high energy price accelerating this discussion and could accelerate the deployment of really green hydrogen?
There is, I've seen reports and estimates of the cost of green hydrogen, and that for the first time ever, it was cheaper than grey hydrogen, simply because the gas price is so high. Also, of course, costs of renewables have come down tremendously over the last year. So I think that stacks up in favor of green hydrogen. But it's still, someone has to take investment decisions and build all that infrastructure.
Yes.
And that will not be based on just the last 6 months of energy prices. That's always a long-term calculation. And I have heard at the stakeholder conference also energy world people talk about, well, this is just a temporary blip and those prices will not stay like that. They will go down again. So if that's the mindset, if that's kind of the expectation that in the future gas again will be plentiful and cheap, then maybe it's not as much of a help as we may like it to be. But on the other hand, I think also this energy security crisis that we now face has hammered home the message that it is important to diversify our energy imports and that people need to think about what are the alternatives to fossil fuels. So I think that is a message that was clearly received by many stakeholders across the economy.
Yes.
And policy as well.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, Florian, thank you so much.
That was brilliant. Thanks for talking to me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We produce the My Energy 2050 podcast to learn about cutting-edge research and the people building our clean energy system. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please share it. The more we spread our message of the ease of an energy transition, the faster we can make it. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where we are the most active on the My Energy 2050 webpage, or on Twitter and Facebook. I'm your host, Michael LaBelle. Thank you for listening to this week's episode.